Second component of ecological forestry that really gets a lot of focus in terms of how we manage our land is what's known as trying to restore late successional forest structure. And what I mean by that is we're basically trying to restore some of those tree sizes or tree distributions or amounts of dead wood that we traditionally used to find in some of our old growth forests or some of our older forest systems. The landscape of Minnesota has changed dramatically since European settlement, and we've really gone from a landscape where we had a lot of older forest conditions to one in which we have a very small percentage. What we're trying to do with restoring late successional structure is that within our managed landscape, bring back some of those elements that many of those species that relied on, large down wood, some of our small mammals or amphibians, or some of those birds that relied on snag trees, trying to bring those back into a more managed setting. And so late successional restoration efforts really are taking kind of old growth or older forests as a benchmark and using those conditions to try to figure out what needs to be integrated into my managed woodland to try to restore some of those elements. As with natural disturbance based management, you really need to get some good understanding of what were some of the historic ranges of conditions that were found in that forest type. And again, that's something you can talk to with your consulting forester or use those ECS or native plant community guides to figure out. There's many components to thinking about managing for late successional structure in the landscape, and through the website we have some links on there where you can read more about the diversity of structures that are often found within old forests. Today I'm just going to touch upon three main topics that deal with managing for late successional forest structure. One is the use of extended rotations, the second is managing for large living trees, and the third is thinking about managing for dead wood out in the forest. As is the case with natural disturbance-based management, again, you're going to need to think about the forest type you're in and how suitable it is both from an ecological standpoint to do a certain approach, as well as from what your economic goals are for your landscape and overall landowner objectives. The first approach I'm going to talk about is what's known as extended rotation forestry. Typically, many of our rotations, that is the final harvest, the age at which that stand is finally harvested and regenerated, is typically based upon either economic criteria, so you're trying to maximize the rate of return on your forest, or it's based on trying to maximize annual production. Both of these are very valid approaches depending on where you are in the landscape, but in the context of how forests naturally develops, many of our stands live long beyond what would be economically mature or even biologically mature. I'm thinking of red pine as an example. We often manage red pine anywhere from 80 to 120 years of age, and then we clear cut harvest them and start over again. But when we look at old red pine forests, many of those trees can live well into the 300s. And so extended rotation is really trying to take some of these forest stands and let them grow a little bit longer so that you get larger trees and really an older aged forest out in the landscape. Again, we're lacking a lot of that out there, and so this is one way to address that need. A side effect of leaving trees out there for a long period of time is they get bigger, so you have bigger trees out there. Some of them might fall over and die, so you start getting some dead wood in the ground. And you often also get more development of an understory beneath them as that stand starts to really space out through natural self-thinning. So beyond thinking about trying to restore old forests to the landscape by having longer rotations within our managed areas, we're also thinking about, when trying to restore a late successional structure, trying to bring back some of those large trees. When we think about an old growth forest, one of the first images that comes to our mind is there's big trees in those stands. And those trees really have developed over a long period of time of natural disturbance and natural mortality that have allowed those trees to get more and more of that growing space and get larger. In forestry, we have a lot of tools that allow trees to get more access to resources, and that's what we use our thinning techniques, where we often will thin around some of our crop trees so we'll give them more growing space so they can get larger faster. Those same approaches can be applied to your woodlot. If your goal is really to get big trees back in your landscape, really for the goal to get some more of the aesthetic qualities of an old growth forest, you can use some of the techniques known as crown thinning or even thinning from below, which will open up the resources of those trees that you'd like to see out there for a long period of time and allow them to get much larger and bring back some of that large tree component to our forest. Depending on what your objectives are, you could easily harvest those trees when you're trying to get some financial return, or you could leave those trees out there in perpetuity depending on what your goal is for your landscape. The last aspect of late successional structure I'm going to talk about is what's known as down woody debris or down logs, as well as standing dead trees or snags. This often is one of the more challenging ones to think about managing your land for, because often when we think about leaving logs in the ground, many folks aesthetically feel that might be a bit messy. But if you think about a lot of the biodiversity we have in the landscape and many of our organisms, they actually rely very heavily on dead wood as either part of their life cycle or for their entire life cycle, either as a place to go underneath for small mammals, for some of our wood decay fungi, or some of our other moss species really rely on that dead wood as an important substrate for completing their life cycle. And so when you're trying to think about managing for late successional structure, one element you want to think about is how much dead wood is out there in my forest, and is there a way for me to maybe increase the size of the wood that's on the ground to really provide that important habitat type. After any harvest or in any forest stand, there's always dead wood out there, but often it's very small dead wood. Really, it's the larger logs that are critical for habitat. And so we're trying to, with late successional restoration approaches, trying to put more dead wood in the ground. Importantly, that dead wood that you put in the ground no longer is something you can capture economically. And so again, you need to think about, do I want to put that log in the ground and forego any economic return I can get from that? Or are there other trees out there that might be better candidates to drop and leave? One of the best candidates that you can use for restoring dead wood are cull trees, a really unacceptable growing stock. These are trees that are likely not very merchantable, and really their value is much higher ecologically than it is economically. And so go out there in your stand, find where you have really poor quality trees and say, these are trees I'm going to leave out there to serve as future dead wood. I really don't care about capturing any of the economic return from them. Often it's really challenging to find a really nice crop tree and think I want to put that tree on the ground, so really focus on some of the poorer quality trees. Not only improving the quality of the ecological conditions out there, you're also increasing the value of your stand by removing some of those poorer formed individuals and increasing growing space for your better formed trees. A second component that's often challenging regarding leaving dead wood in the ground is fire risk. If you're in an area or if you find out you're in a fire dependent community, you might not want to leave a lot of fine fuels in the ground, so thinking about ways to put larger logs in the ground that likely won't carry much of a flame are important. Again, working with your consulting forester, talking to them about fire risk or what makes the most sense in terms of meeting dead wood goals out in the forest is an important part of planning for late successional restoration out on your landscape. The final aspect is just thinking about the messiness or the aesthetics of leaving dead wood out there. Even in the small wood that I'm in today, there's an accumulation of dead wood over there that to many people might seem as a very ugly spot in the forest. And now we have this dead wood, a jumble of course woody debris right there. But very quickly, a lot of that wood will start to degrade, and over time will just represent one log on the forest floor. What may look, from an aesthetic standpoint, very displeasing is a critical component of the ecological integrity of those forests, and really is something that's lacking from a lot of our forest stands in terms of large piece sizes. As with any type of management that's going to happen in your woodlot, really the most important thing is to think about what are your overall objectives and goals for your property, and how well do some of these principles I talked about fit in within those overall goals and objectives. Once you've thought about that, it's important to really sit down with a consulting forester or talk to a DNR forester to discuss how might I implement some management on my land to really meet these goals. And as you're discussing that, talk about what trade-offs there might be with some of the economic goals you have versus some of the more ecological goals, and really find out how willing you are to go down either that ecological or economic route to get an overall achievement of what your goals and objectives are for that land. Secondly, there are some guidelines out there that Minnesota has for site-level forest management practices. Many of the principles I talked about, like leaving behind trees or managing for dead wood, are within those guidelines. And so any good harvest is going to have those structures being incorporated. It's up to you to figure out, do you want to go beyond those guidelines and leave even more leaf trees or leave more dead wood out there? And so that might be a first starting point to think about what's the bare minimum that I need to achieve out there to maintain the sustainability of the land. Finally, this really was a discussion in response to a posting on the My Minnesota Woods website. If there's further questions about this, feel free to post on the website and folks will respond. There's also reading materials up there for you to look at to get more information about this. There's no recipe or really no catch-all management approach that works across the landscape. Again, this is one approach to management. There's also valid approaches just for production forestry or for more multiple use sustained yield. So this is part of our vast toolbox that deals with addressing multiple objectives in the landscape. And so make sure you think about all those different approaches as you come up with a management plan for your property.